pandemic, I guess, would be what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
All right, let's rock and roll.
All right.
All right, here we go. We're live. What's up, everybody? Welcome to another wonderful episode of Afterlife Apologetics. I'm here with my wonderful friend and scholar, Dr. Steve Miller. And today we're going to be continuing our awesome experience journey into deathbed visions, experiences, and all the surrounding evidence for those. For those of you who are returning, welcome. For those of you who this may be your first episode, welcome very much. We want to make a very clear point here that as often as we talk about these experiences being really great evidence from a scholarly standpoint of belief in something beyond the natural realm, Steve and I were just now talking about it, and I know he wants to spend some time kind of elaborating on this point, but we oftentimes can find ourselves so stuck up in the research and viewing the facts and looking at the evidence that we really don't take the time to consider the implications of this. Why are we doing this? Why do we look at the research? Why do we even care about these experiences to begin with? I mean, you could very well just be like, who even cares? And in many senses, that's a very, very valid question. And so I would say, and then I want to hand it over to you, Steve, to talk about it, but I would say, for me, it is fascinating because if heaven is for real, what does that shape in terms of the decisions that we make in everyday life? How do we view, more importantly for me, how do you view what's most important in life? How do you approach your paradigm of values? Do you change what you emphasize? And yes, the evidence suggests that, but I'm imploring you, listener, on a personal level. How do you think this evidence impacts you? Do you care about it? Why don't you care about it? That would be kind of my first question from a curious standpoint is, if you can have people dying, seeing the other side, seeing heaven, seeing hell, confirming information that just seems to be acquired through only supernatural means, if we're to explain it rationally, what am I to do with that information? What is that? Yes, I understand it conceptually, but what does that mean for me personally when it comes to making decisions about what that information means in everyday life? This podcast, this journey that Steve and I are on, is an attempt to walk through those questions and the implications they have for you personally, as well as us personally. They have shaped us. And that is why we find them so fascinating and worthy of the time to spend this getting together every week, talking about it, sharing our research with you guys and our thoughts on the research and engaging with viewer questions. It's because we feel that it is not only powerful from an intellectual, evidential standpoint, but it's incredibly powerful from a personal and emotional, volitional standpoint, to where you can say, I think not only is this good evidence, but this is something that pricks my heart, that makes me think I should take action on this information, and in lieu of this information, change the way in which I live. Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, kind of what brought this up was that after our last episode and we had turned everything off and we were just talking to each other, we're like, wow, this is, I mean, we're talking about real evidence done in really good studies, real evidence for the afterlife. I thought, we're trying to not be enthusiastic and preachy and all these things, but I think sometimes we go overboard being so objective, so sound minded, everything, and just walking through the evidence. Sometimes we just need to go, wow, wow, what? I mean, these guys in the late 1800s, the Sidgwicks and others, they, they interviewed 17,000 people in a very intellectual population, and they came up with, and I didn't have a statistic last time, sorry about that, but it was between 2 and 6% of the population that was claiming to have these crisis apparitions where they'd see somebody after they had died or at the point of death. A person died far away, they had no idea they were dying, and then they saw the person. And then they would write down a note often saying, I believe so and so died. I just saw them vividly in my room saying goodbye. And, you know, 2 to 6% of the population, that's kind of corresponding to the 4% who have had near death experiences. Okay, so now you got like maybe 8% of the population, unless there's some overlap, let's say at least 6%. you've got millions of Americans testifying that they've had this experience. So if they're seeing a person who's just died, that's after their life, which sounds a lot like the afterlife, right? It's after their life here, they're seeing it. This is stupendous. This is incredible. I mean, we're looking at evidence over and over and over. I'll hear people say, well, hear my students say, well, we really can't know anything about the afterlife till after we die, but, we'll just kind of see what happens when we get there because there's no way to have evidence because it's after we've died. What we're saying is, no, 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 we can circumvent that problem because we're seeing people on the other side who have already died. So, I mean, this is really impressive. How does it change my life? It gives me a purpose in life. Even if I don't see wonderful things happening around me and lives being transformed, even if my health is bad or, even if things are going wrong in life, I can say, it all makes sense in the end. When I get to the other side, I'll be able to say, you know what? It made sense what I went through, what I had to endure. My life was important, whether I saw it or other people saw it or not. There's a song out now called Heaven Changes Everything. It really does. I mean, if this is all life is and then you die, you can make little purposes, but there's no ultimate purpose.
Mhm.
But if I'm saying, when I love my family, when I love my wife, when I sacrifice for those around me, when I'm nice to people, if I'm saying that there are rewards in the afterlife, that really counts, that I'm really impacting people for eternity, that's what originally attracted me to the Christian life as a sophomore in high school. I had no purpose in life. I just get out my dirt bike, go riding in the mountains, get home. Oh, there's still some time left before supper. And I do my studies, but there was no purpose in it all. When I met Christ, it was like my life became filled with purpose. Didn't become easy. Might have been harder, certainly sometimes, but it was just filled with purpose and a joy that circumvented all my didn't matter what my circumstances were, I could still have a joy in the midst of it because I knew that in God's eyes it all made sense. So I think what we're looking at lines of evidence that I think, we look at individuals who experience these things like crisis apparitions, where you saw a person that it's just deceased. And then I'll say, hey, here's a major study. You show that this is happening on a large scale, much larger scale than chance could explain. This is strong evidence that there's an afterlife. It's not a blind faith thing anymore. It's something that we can latch on to, and it includes our brain and not just our emotions. I just think this is fantastic, and Christopher Hitchens, a great atheist, he once said, "Oh, this stuff about near-death experiences, that's BS because those people didn't really die; they came back." And I'm like, "Well, that's kind of a shallow comment, showing that
Yeah.
you must have not studied this because you're seeing people on the other side who who have either just died or in other experiences that we'll get to in a week or so." People who maybe were dead for decades and they're back talking to you. Wow, this is significant stuff that there's really evidence to deal with. And when it hits my head and I can wrap my head around it, that affects my emotions. That helps me to fully realize, oh, heaven is for real. And whatever I go through in this life, it has purpose because of this.
Mm.
I don't know. Sometimes we just need to stop and realize the impact of what we're talking about. So, people will say, "Oh, well, we can't know about anything till after we die." But think of the different experiences we've talked about where people see loved ones alive and well on the other side. Near-death experiences, they see this. Deathbed visions, where people are just about to die. They're talking about seeing loved ones when the loved ones come and say, to them, okay, I'm here to take you home within about 24 hours, they're dying, whether you expect it or not. Crisis apparitions, where you see somebody who's at the point of death or has died, and shared death experiences when you've got completely, people who are completely fine, their brain's not dying, and yet they share this experience with others. So this is pretty powerful stuff, and thank you so much for taking the time to actually walk through these lines of evidence. You want to move on to chapter
Yeah.
4, or do you want to express anything about what this means to you?
Well, I think that we definitely should probably spend a whole episode probably discussing that, because I think you brought up some really great points that I want to dive into further. But for the sake of time, I do want to try to stick on topic today to get through this. But I would, Steve, in the future, let's go through a little bit more of kind of those implications, because I think you brought up some great points that it would be fun to kind of walk through those just from an apologetic perspective of
Hmm.
why isn't it easier? How do these experiences affect me personally? And things like Christopher Hitchens' statement, which I think is complete and utter dismissiveness of the actual point. It's not really engaging with any of the evidence. It's kind of just hand waving it away. So I do think that that is very impactful and important. And there's a lot of fun philosophical discussions to have in regards to those. But for us to continue, we'll continue on. I know we wanted to dedicate a short amount of time to that. So what I want to do now is I want to quickly review what we've kind of gone over up to this point. All right. And so for
Because
those,
we're
yeah, this is part
building a
three.
cumulative case, and unless we keep reviewing, you don't see how it's accumulating. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
and I'll be brief. I'll be brief so you guys can know. If you want to, like I said in the previous episode, if you want to go further onto any of these, of course, just go back to the previous episodes where we discussed these at great length. Here, just a very quick touch point, just so you guys can kind of know where we're at. So we've gone through three major lines of evidence, and we'll be moving on to the fourth one today. The third one got its own entire episode because Steve was so long-winded. Jeez, about our third line of evidence. But so I think that's episode 19 where we go through the third line, and then episode 18 we go through 1 and 2. So line number 1: the ability to influence our time of death by solely mental means seems unlikely given a naturalist, materialist, physical theory of the brain. So this is to say that if we are just our brains, then why does it seem we can will ourselves to live past the seemingly physical limitations? All right. So line 1 is to say there are people who are choosing to prolong their life to get to special days and then dying on those days because there's something personally significant to them that's happening on that day. Now, under naturalism, if we are just our brains and our bodies die when our bodies die, how can people influence and affect that? Line of evidence number 2. Under naturalism, how could we know we are dying without sufficient physical predictors of death? In this line of evidence, Steve talks about people having, in a sense, a supernatural knowledge of, hey, I'm going to die tomorrow. Please come. I need to speak with you. We're going to talk about things like me making things right with you. So oftentimes, this line of evidence is accompanied by what seems to be supernatural knowledge of an impending death when we have no reason to believe that physically this person is about to die. Okay, so that's line number 2. Line number 3, naturalism indicates that people should not be able to have accurate premonitions of the deaths of others. This is what Steve was referring to as crisis apparitions. This is the ability to see somebody else at like a dream or different circumstances to where you would have a premonition or a dream, a very accurate dream of someone's impending death. As a matter of fact, we had someone comment on that video, Steve, saying that she saw the death of her uncle before it happened. And so it just goes to show you that even these videos go out to the world, and then we find people who show up and say, this is actually happening for me as well. And if you're like, that seems a little far-fetched, go to the previous episode. We discuss in great length the studies that Steve cites in his book that really support this idea of people having accurate premonitions of the death of others that seem to come true. All right. So those are the three
And
evidence.
I had a student just this last week talk about a grandfather of hers who seemed to be in perfect health, but all of a sudden he started talking about seeing someone on the other side, and sure enough, he just said his goodbyes and died. And she said, "That's why I believe in deathbed experiences." So, I mean, these are all around us. You just have to start asking. And did I mention Camille Flammarion, the great astronomer, French astronomer? If you're
I don't
looking for a
remember.
replication of this other study that we talked about, he started early in his life collecting collecting stories of people talking about these things that had happened. You know, where they were seeing someone on the other side. And rather than today people just give their initials because 'cause they're afraid of, you know, telling their names. He gave their names, and these were high-ranking people, people who administrated hospitals, top scientists, all kinds of people. He's got, like, 3 volumes on this that he put together by the end of his life because people kept reporting to him. Famous astronomer, all the, greatest accolades the country of France had were given to him. 3 volumes on that, which are really incredible, and I read through those. So we got through 3. Now we're on line of evidence number 4.
We are. So let me introduce it, Steve, and then as usual, I'll hand it over to you so you can go and talk about it. Okay. All right. So line of evidence 4. If DBE's deathbed experiences are either normal dreams or hallucinations, then why are the dying often surprised to see people on the other side who are not known to have died?
I'm feeling a poem coming on.
All right, let's hear it.
So the poem is this: What if you slept? And what if in your sleep you dreamed? And what if in your dream you went to heaven and there plucked a strange and beautiful flower? And what if when you awoke you had that flower in your hand? Ah, what then? Now, that poem, I think, expresses I did not write it, but I think it expresses the essence of what we're talking about when we're talking about evidence that people come back with. It's not that they just have some dream of heaven, but they come back and something that they saw over there, they bring back with them.
Mm.
So there's a great physicist, Sir William Barrett. He wrote a book called Deathbed Visions, which I'll show here, just a small book. But, he was a great physicist during his time, Sir William Barrett, and uh, his wife was a physician. One day, she came home and said, "Boy, I've gotta tell you what's going on with this patient." And the patient was dying in childbirth, and she saw somebody on the other side that she had no way of knowing had died. And and Barrett was just so struck with this. He collected this, began to collect other illustrations of people who were at the point of death and saw people on the other side that they did not know had died. So that's like the flower that somebody woke up and saw. Wow, it wasn't just a dream. I really saw this, and that kind of shows the state of the evidence. So these are called peak Indarian experiences. There was an explorer who thought that they had found this new world and in Central America, and then they looked over when they reached the peak of the mountain. They looked over, and there was another ocean on the other side, and it was like a peak, there. They were able to see something just really special but unexpected. So they call these Pekindarian experiences. Bruce Grayson, who's a professor emeritus of psychiatry and neurobehavioral sciences at the University of Virginia, he wrote an article in the Anthropology and Humanism Journal talking about Pekindarian experiences. Here's one of the cases that his reports. So let me just give you a case to think about. Jenny, age 8, died on a Wednesday, fact that was intentionally kept hidden from her friend Edith. At noon on that Saturday, Edith selected 2 of her photographs to be sent to Jeannie, providing evidence that she still thought Jeannie was still alive. Shortly thereafter, she lapsed into unconsciousness, but that evening she awakened and spoke of seeing deceased friends. Then suddenly she said to her father in great surprise, "Why, Papa, I'm going to take Jenny with me." She then reached out her arms and said, "Oh, Jenny, I'm so glad you're here," lapsed back into unconsciousness and died. And so she saw her friend Jenny on the other side, and yet no one had told her that Jenny had died. So Bruce Grayson and many other great thinkers have looked at this and said, wow, this is pretty strong evidence that it's not just a dream, it's not just a hallucination. How could they have known that this person had died? Uh, Dr. Kubler Ross, famous psychiatrist and authority on
Yeah.
death during her time, she said, quote, "In all the years that I've quietly collected data, every single child who mentioned that someone was waiting for them mentioned a person who had actually preceded them in death, even if by only a few moments. And yet none of these children had been informed of the recent death of the relatives by us at any time." So Kubler-Ross saw this as well. And I just think that's pretty good evidence that it's not just a hallucination or vivid dream. How does it
Mm.
strike you?
Yeah, same. I think it would be really challenging to have it be so accurate on a consistent basis if it was a hallucination. Sure, blind squirrel finds a nut every now and then, which is just to allude to the fact that you could have the numbers play out in your favor where, yeah, occasionally the kid is guessing a name and that name happens to coincide with someone they knew that had died. Sure. But for it to be done at such a consistent rate, and obviously it's confirmed through multiple studies as you detail here in the book, I think it's a great reason to believe it as another line of evidence.
Let's move on to line of evidence number 5 then. And this gets us into a different type of phenomena actually at the time of death. And do you want to start us off with that, or?
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So let's real quick before we transition, Steve. Let's just do a quick review on this four before we move real fast off of that. So what he's saying here in four, we moved to, we did, Steve. We moved away from ranking it 1 through 10, which I kind of want to get you back
Ah,
on track of doing that because I think that's helpful in terms of like kind of collapsing that point and allowing people to kind of come to a conclusion of, yeah, I would rate
sure.
that 1 out of 10, whatever. So essentially, what we're saying in this line of evidence number four. By the way, let me plug his book. This is in Steve's. This is his dissertation book, right? Deathbed experiences as evidence for the afterlife. I know you guys probably couldn't see it just there. I'm sorry. Definitely go get this on Amazon if you guys want to follow along. This is where a lot of the notes are being pulled from. It's just easier for us to look back at our written works than trying to do it all from memory. That's kind of crazy. So this line of evidence number four is just essentially saying when people are on their deathbeds, they seem to be having conversations with, preceded by, welcomed in by people who died and they had no knowledge of death. Meaning, in a lot of these situations, it's the death of someone they were close to being withheld from them because they were in circumstances themselves where maybe the parents, friends of the family were like, look, let's not burden them with the information that Susie just died because they're on the hospital bed themselves. And then they're laying on the hospital bed and they go, oh, Susie's here to greet me. And everybody, and that's kind of an eerie moment in the hospital for the family, as you can imagine, because they know Susie died 2-3 days ago in a whole different hospital. And as far as they know, no one's spoken to them. And if someone did speak to them, that seems like a really odd time to bring up that information and bring it up in such a positive light of Susie's here. She's talking to me. She's saying it's time to go to heaven, and I'm gonna leave you guys and go be with Susie. So that's kind of line of evidence number four. And as Steve mentioned, there's many studies, and I think again, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, sure, her research is very pro the afterlife hypothesis. You can just see it in the way she writes. And even in the quote here, every single child, again, the skeptic in me wants to be like, did every child say that? But nonetheless, in all the years I have quietly collected data, every single child who mentioned that someone was waiting for them mentioned a person who had actually preceded them in death, even if only by a few moments. Again, if someone died down the hallway an hour ago and now your child's seeing them on the other side, that again would be very, think about yourself in that circumstance and how that would actually affect you if you were watching that happen in real time. So in terms of what I would rank this, I definitely give this, in my book, an 8 out of 10. Anything that's giving supernatural knowledge to me is incredibly creepy or confirmative, however you want to look at it, of the other side revealing information to us on a metaphysical level.
And these are some very people with great reputations who are passing these on to us. I mean, Sir William Barrett. This is not just something we found anonymously on the internet.
Yeah.
These are people who are teaching at top universities who have reputations to keep in line. It's him, a famous physicist, and his physician wife. So I gave it a 7 out of 10. And I think that's more likely than not. To me, it's good, better evidence for the afterlife than some naturalistic explanation. So you as a listener, rate these as you go. We're not pushing our ideas on you. You may assess things a little differently than us. You give it your rating of 0 to 10 on each of these.
All right. Okay, so line of evidence number 5. Some brain deterioration. Honestly, I'm gonna load you guys up with this one. This is personally one of my favorites right here. Okay. Line of evidence number 5. Some brain deteriorating diseases such as Alzheimer's and dementia and meningitis render brains more and more dysfunctional. Then how, under naturalism, do patients with these diseases often experience sudden lucidity, indicating consciousness, optimal brain function, memories, and rationality before dying? And you have a cool quote here. I want to read the quote. The quote. Toward the end, quote, toward the end, he emerged from a coma, opened his eyes, looked upward, and said, Mina, it is very beautiful over there. End quote. That is inventor Thomas Edison's last words.
So he had been in a coma. You're not expecting him. When somebody's dying like this of a long-term illness, you're expecting it'll only get worse, only get worse, only get worse. And there, he's in a coma. All of a sudden, he emerges from the coma, says, "It is very beautiful over there," and then dies. And that reminds me of Steve Jobs. You know, he looks up in the corner of the room, says, "Oh wow, oh wow, oh wow." His last words.
Mm-hmm.
They're seeing something extraordinarily significant. Yet, for many of these, they shouldn't really be able to think that clearly if it's a disease that destroys the mind, such as Alzheimer's or other diseases that are like someone who has a tumor that's eating away at the brain. It's not just pushing the brain to the side, but some of these tumors eat away the brain to where there's hardly any brain left. So, So Michael Naum and Bruce Grayson, both researchers, they spoke of the unexpected return of mental clarity and memory shortly before death in patients suffering from severe psychiatric or neurological disorders. Terminal lucidity, and it's being studied in Europe and different places now.
Well, I want to point out, Steve, you note this in the book, but this is something I've also done in my own research, is that it is so common that it does have just a quick phrase, terminal lucidity, that it's so common that it's like, oh yeah, that's what we would refer to as terminal lucidity. Right at the moment of death, it seems like the person who is experiencing these brain deteriorating diseases suddenly has a moment of the return of their faculties, the ability to communicate, remember, talk to these people, almost as if here's your one last window, say goodbye, and transition.
And so a practical warning, if you're taking care of a loved one who's dying of some disease like this, sometimes they just perk up. They'd been in a coma for days, maybe weeks. Then they suddenly perk up and start talking to everyone around them. Don't think, oh, it's a miracle. They've been healed. Maybe they're healed. God does heal people sometimes. But it may be terminal lucidity, and it's time for you to say your goodbyes.
Yeah, you got a
If there's
window.
anything that needs to be forgiven or
Yeah.
anything that needs to be said, go ahead and say it, because this may be that their mind, their soul is leaving their old decrepit body and brain, and they're just having a last moment of lucidity. So consider that. So Michael Naum, great researcher, collected 83 cases of terminal lucidity, published them. This is something that's been studied pretty well. One person, let's see, Alexander Bethiani, and he's a chair of philosophy at International Academy of Philosophy University in Liechtenstein, and they found about 10% of the Alzheimer's patients that he was studying were, again, their brains are deteriorating quickly at the end, yet sudden lucidity. So that's a good many people, a high percentage of those that are experiencing it. So, maybe I could just give the case of David. I've got a lot of cases in here, but
Give us
Dr.
a few.
Scott
Yeah, give us a few.
Dr. Scott Haig, assistant clinical professor of orthopedic surgery at Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons, Columbia University, extremely well respected. Okay, so Dr. Scott Haig's reporting this, not something we pulled off the internet. One of those patients, David, um, lay terminally ill in the hospital. The cancer that started in his lungs had spread to his brain and was rapidly destroying it. His family was supporting him as best they could. It says when the doctors rescanned his head, there was barely any brain left. This is Dr. Haig writing. The cerebral machine that talked and wondered, winked and sang, the machine that remembered jokes and birthdays where the big fish hid on the hot days was nearly gone, replaced by lumps of haphazardly growing gray stuff.
Hmm.
Gone with the machine seemed David as well. No expression, no response of any kind. This person is not going to be talking anymore. It's gone, right? Yet, after he died, Dr. Haig saw the nurse who attended David and his family the night of his death. And the nurse said, he woke up, you know, doctor, just after you left and said goodbye to them all. Like I'm talking to you right here, like a miracle. He talked to them, patted them, smiled for about 5 minutes. Then he went out again and passed in the hour. 2 weeks later, the doctor saw Carol, the wife, in the lobby, and she said, yes, he sure did, and confirmed the whole report by the nurse. But he says this. This is the doctor's words. He said it wasn't David's brain that woke up to say goodbye that Friday. His brain had already been destroyed. Tumor metastases don't simply occupy space and press on things, leaving a whole brain. The metastases actually replace tissue. Where the gray stuff grows, the brain is just not there. What woke my patient that Friday was simply his mind forcing its way through a broken brain, a father's final act to comfort his family.
Hmm.
Dr. Haig says, I cannot, this is his conclusion, I cannot be a materialist. I cannot ignore the internal evidence of my own mind. It would be hypocritical. And worse, it would be cowardly to ignore these occasional appearances of the spirits of others, of minds uncloaked in naked virtue like David's goodbye.
Oh, that's such a
Boy, I
cool.
thought that was just a powerful
Yeah,
case.
that is, and that's a great quote.
I
Minds
gave it an 8 out of
uncloaked.
10.
Minds uncloaked. Yeah, I gave it a 9 out of 10, and the reason being is, for me, this is really hard to neglect on a naturalistic perspective, because if naturalism were true, you would see in these cases clear cut, right? Think of it like a junkyard, okay? I hate the fact that I'm equating it to this, but this is just how it makes the most sense in my mind. Think of it like a junkyard. You go out to a junkyard and you pop open the hood, and there are just massive pieces of the engine gone. You know, no battery, the transmission's just missing. Axle, there's massive, massive critical pieces of this engine are just absent. You shut the hood, you go in, you turn the key, fires up. Your mind would be completely and utterly just blown away. You would be in shock of like, how is this possible? But then when others come to try to fire up the engine, it doesn't work, right? Because we know that there's missing pieces, or outright the entire engine is just gone. It's an empty engine block, and it's turning on. It's turning over and running for a moment, drives maybe even a little bit, and then it just dies. You would walk away from that experience completely transformed and changed. And probably why this shaped me so much, Steve, is this impacted me and this is a little bit of a digressing, but I think it's an interesting thing from just the way I viewed people. Is part of the way this impacted me was it completely and utterly transformed the way I would look at things like depression, suicidal tendencies, just different illnesses. Because I think that within Christianity, there's this tendency to look at brain illnesses and brain diseases as these things that you can just overcome, right? But we wouldn't say that. We wouldn't necessarily say that too. Yes, there's prayer life and there's the ability to pray about it and hope for spiritual healing. And those things do happen. And I think that they're very much real. But there's a lot of times where they don't happen. And people spend their entire lives with this ailment and they die with this ailment. But what it did for me is it kind of confirmed that you could just as well have parts of the brain broken and the mind is still trapped in a sense in there. It's locked away. And so it's like when you talk to someone who's in a coma, you mentioned they might come through with terminal lucidity and they might have been listening the whole time, and it's like you look at those scenes in a movie and you're like, they're sitting there talking to the unconscious person. And I know that I used to kind of look at these scenes like, oh yeah, whatever, that's romantic. Yeah. Now I look at it totally differently of like, they very well could be in there internalizing all of it. And then that information will become accessible to them should they have a terminal lucid episode and be able to recall this conversation and recall this interaction. So all in all, it just kind of reshaped the way I saw the mind and the brain interacting with one another and made me realize just as much as, if I have a broken arm, my ability to move the arm may as well be there, right? But I can't actualize the potential of moving my arm because it's broken. In the same sense, there could be part of people's brains that are broken, and therefore the mind doesn't have the ability to actualize the potential of the brain just like someone else would. So, and for me, that's why this line was so big, because it kind of transformed me and my view of the world on multiple landscapes. But for deathbed experiences, I thought, like I gave that illustration earlier of the car with no engine, I thought that was a very eerie. It's funny for me because I say creepy, and I don't mean to be insulting, but it's funny because it's like how creepy it is to me is how good of a line of evidence it is in some of these cases, because the creepiness comes from the fact of like, you can't just explain that away, and it's further evidence for the fact of there is more beyond what we are in now. And so this line of evidence for me is absolutely 9 out of 10. Of course, I don't think I give any of them 10 out of 10s, but it is a 9 out of 10 because, like I said, if you said there are magic cars out here and you popped open the hood and showed no engine and then drove the car for a little bit, I would be convinced there's magic cars out there, because that would be such a convincing episode to bear witness to.
One of the many reasons I appreciate Charlie is he comes up with the junkyard illustration, which really we have to do in this sense. We have to keep coming up with analogies that are parallel in order for it to fully sink in. That's why we need to take these arguments, go out on the back porch, back deck or whatever,
Smoke on that old
smoke on that philosophical pipe a little bit and say, what if I were going into a junkyard, pop the hood, there's no engine there, put it down, turn the key and it starts. Yes, that's creepy. And the next one, the next line of evidence continues the creepy thing, because we're talking about the lifelong mentally challenged.
There you go. Feeds right into my point.
So this is a car that never had an engine under the hood. Okay. It had major problems in it.
Yeah, it's missing a lot of
it's not.
parts.
And to me, this brings it evidence even to a little deeper level, because if someone was losing it toward the end with Alzheimer, maybe you could, but I don't know, the one where his brain or the husband's brain was being replaced, that's getting real wild. These are people who sometimes their entire lives have been in what we used to call, a retarded state, or severe learning disabilities. And so the line of evidence number 6 is the lifelong mentally challenged, sometimes become lucid, clear communicators and thinkers at the time of death. So there have been some studies on that, a 1975 Russian study on terminal lucidity and mental patients. But let me give you one that came from Germany. This was well attested by a chief physician, very respected physician during his time, and it's about Katharina Ehmer, Ehmer. Probably butchered that German name, but this was her state of existence. Kathy, Catherine, they call her Kathy, was among the patients with the most severe mental disabilities who have ever lived in our institution. From birth on, she was seriously retarded. She had never learned to speak a single word. She stared for hours at a particular spot, then she fidgeted for hours without a break. She gorged her food, fouled herself day and night, uttered an animal like sound, and slept. In all the time she lived with us, we have never seen that she had ever taken notice of her environment, even for a second. So if somebody's going by her in a wheelchair, she doesn't even notice. Not even talking about understanding what's going on. We had to amputate one of her legs. She was wasting away. Then this is all written by the doctor, okay, the physician.
Yeah.
One day I was called by one of our physicians who's respected as a scientist and a psychiatrist. He said, "Come immediately to Kathy. She is dying." When we entered the room together, we did not believe our eyes and ears. Kathy, who had never spoken a single word, being entirely mentally disabled from birth on, sang dying songs to herself. Specifically, she sang over and over again, "Where does the soul find its home, its peace? Peace, peace, heavenly peace." She began to sing this over and over again. For half an hour she sang. Her face, up until then so stultified, was transfigured and spiritualized. Then she quietly passed away. Like myself and the nurse who cared for her, the physician had tears in his eyes. And I give another account of the same thing confirmed by another physician who saw that as well. Um, this was totally unexpected, not predicted at all from a naturalistic perspective. It seemed that the physicians themselves interpreted it as a miracle. It brought in sharp relief the mind body problem. Her brain, her body was dysfunctional, but apparently there's something beyond the brain, a mind that was at work to where she heard these songs and internalized them even when it seemed like she was not internalizing anything. And what does this say about the value of human life? Um, One of the nurses who experienced this said, when you're working at a facility like this and you see these people, you get kind of callous and, well, they're not much more than a blade of
Yeah.
grass, the way they can think, and you begin to treat them as if they're not of worth. And yet biblically, we know everyone's in the image of God, even Kathy, right? And this nurse said, "Oh my goodness, I realized there's a real person inside of Kathy."
Yeah, I want to
And
actually read
sometimes it
that.
takes something like that.
Yeah, Steve, let me read that bottom part, because I do think that and it kind of echoes back to the point I was making earlier of this these this medical team had the same realization that I just talked about of you don't really think that person's there, but here I read from the book. We witnessed the dying of this girl with deepest emotions. Her death posed many questions to us. Obviously, Kathy had only superficially not participated in all that happened in her surroundings. In reality, she had apparently internalized much of it. Because where did she know the text and the melody of this song from, if not from her surroundings? Moreover, she had comprehended the contents of the song and used it appropriately in the most crucial hour of her life. This appeared like a miracle to us. Even bigger, however, was the miracle that Kathy, up to now entirely mute, could suddenly recite the text of the song clearly and intelligibly. Dr. Wittenben stated over and over again, quote, "From a medical perspective, I am confronted with a mystery. Kathy has suffered so many severe infections of meningitis that due to the anatomical changes in the cortical brain tissue, it is not comprehensible how the dying woman could suddenly sing so clearly and intelligibly," end quote. And that is what I'm talking about. It's where you start to see, just like a broken arm prevents the usage of the arm, even though the potential to do it is there. It's the same thing with, as referenced in the book, someone who would be considered severely retarded or learning disabilities or whatever you want to say. There is anatomically something preventing the actualization of what we would deem normal functioning of a brain. And that is what makes you rethink and reshape how you view not only the metaphysics of the brain and the mind, but also how you interact with someone like that on a dying bed who may have dementia, who may have Alzheimer's, because they very well could be internalizing it. They just don't have the actual capability to realize it.
So we took care of my grandmother, who died at age 110. She lived next door, lived in her own house with my mother and me taking care of her, my dad while he was alive. 110. In her last year, she really wasn't interacting much. But that doesn't mean she's worth any less than the most brilliant conversationists out there today. And I think this tells us something about being made in the image of God, why we should look after them. Under Hitler, they would go into Austria, I remember, and would and if you had the mentally people with severe mental problems, they thought nothing of taking those out because they were what they call them useless eaters. They call them useless eaters.
Yeah.
And this was a part of what was going on in Germany at the time these people were writing, and they were using this as an argument to say, no, there are real people inside of there. We've still got to take care of them, even though they're not moving our economy forward or have some kind of worth to society. They have worth in themselves. A very good reminder to us about the biblical view of humanity and the worth of people. Do
Yeah.
we need to? We've almost got an hour. Do we need to just
Yeah, I
hold
think
off for now?
this will be a good kind of spot to camp it out. So I would say that we'll kind of pick this up on the next lines of evidence next week. But again, we want to continue to take time to push you guys to think about this on a personal level, how these things can transform both the way you view reality, but also how they line up with Christian teachings. I think that the light of this evidence, in particular, this line of evidence with the mentally challenged, reinforces the Christian principle of all of us being made, all of humanity being made in God's image, in a sense that it allows you to see, Steve, you mentioned in the past, a sociopath expressing restraint may very well be seen as more favorable in the eyes of God than, say, a Mother Teresa. And that's because we don't get all the facts. And I think that's obviously why God says, vengeance is mine, because you don't know all the information you need to make the best decision. I do. Christianity seems to create this value system around human beings. And when you study things like deathbed experiences and things like terminal lucidity, both in normal functioning people with degrading diseases and people who have had degrading diseases, frankly, for the entirety of their existence on this plane, you start to kind of see those important lessons in Christianity peek through and confirm this information in a supernatural way, where you can start to respect the humanity, the imago Dei, the image of God that is on this person. And you can say, I can't quite corroborate and communicate with them the way I want to, but that could be very much just like, if I have a broken arm, I can't pick up a baseball and throw it. If my arm is completely shattered, I can't just pick up a baseball and throw it. And you wouldn't say that's because I'm less of a human. You would just say, oh, well, because his arm is broken. If his arm wasn't broken, he would be able to pick up this baseball and throw it. And so in that sense, it's like, that's to me is where it's fascinating, of the rubber meeting the road of, yes, the research is fascinating. The evidence is fascinating. Deathbed visions are fascinating. But this is also the fun part where the research starts to interact a little bit with theology. And you see this interplay between the two worlds. And you start to say things like, this is going to completely alter the way that I interact with people who are mentally, challenged or have these issues from now on, because now I can see it. I look at them now as I would someone who has broken legs.
Yes.
I don't look at a person with broken legs as less. I just say, look, their legs are broken, and that is why they cannot walk. It is not because they don't have the ability to walk or they are less than me. Just like if my legs were broken, it'd be much the same. And maybe you think that, I'm an idiot for not have realizing this sooner, but it was a big deal for me. And you very well may be right, but it was a big deal for me to kind of make this realization and see things like depression, for example, could very well be something that is elicited by broken aspects of the brain. And it's not necessarily fair for me to go to that person and just toughen up, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and move on with life, because very well they may not have the actual capacity to do that. They are limited in the way that they could do that.
And so Jesus says, "Judge not, lest you be judged yourselves." Someone else that's a real problem person, that does somebody who just can't seem to get ahead in life. Sometimes these have a problem, like many people who have ADD also have a problem with their executive function in their brain. And sometimes they'll take a pill that helps them with that, and all of a sudden, boom, they're right on top of their studies, they're right on top of their work, they're moving forward. But then if they have to stop taking the medication because it has bad side effects, they're back to their old selves. They can't seem to concentrate and get things done. As Christians, we don't. We need to say, well, listen, that person's not succeeding a lot in life, but maybe I would be the same way if I had
Mm,
their brain,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Or,
definitely.
yeah, that person doesn't seem too nice and they're awful when they're in traffic. And okay, well,
Yeah.
maybe they're doing the best they can. Believe the best, leave the judging to God. We don't have to do the judging down here. Just love people. And
Mm,
that's what we get from near death and deathbed experiences. Love is supreme. Love is what counts. God is love. If you're missing out on the love thing, you're missing out on everything.
mm,
You're not just missing out on one little aspect. You've missed the whole deal because God is love. Love God, love your neighbor, love the people with disabilities, love the people that aren't as smart and sharp and whatever as you are. We're all smart in our own ways. We're all dumb in our own ways. Let's accept one another, love one another. And if we're doing that, we can mess up a lot of other things, but don't mess with the love thing. That's where it's at.
that's such a good point, Steve. I feel bad for even adding on to it, but it is humbling to think that the people we place up on a platform, this occurred to me I think about this a lot as a business person. I'm an entrepreneur. I have businesses, and you hear a lot of this business talk of people talking about, just do this, just do that, and pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and you can do it too. And I did it. And while there is value in that, okay, there's value in
Mhm.
that. There's also the reality of some people wake up one day and something completely unfair happens to them. Maybe they're stolen away. Maybe they're born with a lower intelligence level, like they just didn't have the genes to be a genius. Maybe they didn't have the genes to be a physical specimen on the football field and things of that nature. And we do live in a world where the tendency is to raise those people up on a platform and be like, they should be in the Hall of Fame. Look at what they've accomplished. And I think that's why Jesus is just like, you are going to be shocked when you get to the afterlife and I show you who God really treasured, who lived lives that God really valued, and who just lived for themselves, and really was like, we just don't have the ability to see this world the way God does. And I think it's just going to be such a but this research and this evidence and the principles that come through this, and of course within Christian teachings, show us that the paradigm with which we make value judgments is most of the time completely inaccurate. Our gut instincts.
Oh, and I could see Jesus' disciples whooshing away the little kids, and Jesus is like, "Let the little children come to me. The kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these.
Mm,
And unless you become as a child, you've missed the whole thing, right? It's
mm,
all about humility. It's about the things that we don't raise up in our society as great
mm.
examples. The most humble person in our community. We don't have a prize for that.
Yeah.
So it's a really topsy turvy world that Jesus has put before us, and we're continually trying to line up our lives with these deep counterintuitive principles that he told us.
Yeah.
You know, we're trying to climb the ladder of success. He's saying, go down the ladder and find somebody down there and help them along.
Mm.
The total opposite of all the
But
self help
Jesus, no one
literature.
will see me doing that because I'll be down there. And
Oh,
Jesus is like, yeah, that's the
uh,
point. That's the point.
that's the point.
All right. Well, guys, I hope that we, Steve and I's heart is to try to bridge the gap between the academics, the scholarly, and the practical, the everyday. How does this actually impact my relationship as, my wife, with my daughter, with my friends, my family? How does this actually take shape? And so hopefully we did some bridging of that gap today. But if not, that's fine. We're going to keep getting better. We're going to keep talking about it because we both think it's extremely important to tie these two worlds together. I know a lot of you really like when we kind of go into the evidence and talk about deathbed visions and talk about near-death experiences and all that fun stuff. And it is very cool and very fascinating, but there's also a very practical element, and that's where Steve and I have very much, grown our own friendship, is just really talking about where the rubber meets the road in terms of, okay, this is all well and good, and this is fascinating. It's great to write books on and talk about, but how does this actually take shape and create actions that will matter and echo into eternity and my everyday life? So I hope you guys found value in today's episode. God bless. We love you guys. We'll see you guys on the